Join the provost, who should be up here, bringing greetings, but I'm a very poor substitute. Honored to be at the podium to say thank you, Darren, for your wonderful leadership and stewardship of the Institute of Faith and Learning, for this gathering of scholars in the finest, vibrant tradition of Christian higher education. I was especially delighted to hear that we have co-discoverers. That's what I call students. There are co-discoverers, so call them so, but we're all students. And hopefully we're discoverers, but we also need those to come alongside us as co-discoverers. So for those who have journeyed from beautiful Georgetown and Union and Kentucky and Tennessee, and then our fellow folks from East Texas at LeTourneau, thank you so much for being here. For scholars from literally around the world, not just North America. And in terms of recognition, I would be quite remiss if I did not ask one of the members of the Baylor University Board of Regents, Linda Bryan, to stand and be recognized, please. Thank you for your service. And speaking of Bryans, a former member of the Board of Regents, Bill Bryan. Would you be kind enough to stand, please? Well, this is a hallowed evening. The pagans call it Halloween. Children, and perhaps even some folks old enough not to act like children, are out and about right now in these pagan but cute rituals. They're dressed up as ghosts and goblins. I have a grandson who's dressed this very evening as Elvis. I think that's fairly innocent. I have a granddaughter who at this moment is dressed up as a bumblebee, but she thinks she's a butterfly. You know, every time hallowed evening rolls around, I'm reminded of a story told by the late Judge Robert Bork. I had the great privilege of serving on the Court of Appeals for a number of years with Judge Bork. The co-discoverers here will say, isn't that a name from the ancient past? Well, not so ancient. But he was an unsuccessful nominee for the United States Supreme Court back in 1987. But for many years before that, Judge Bork served with great distinction on the Yale Law faculty. He was both a legendary teacher in the classroom and a very prolific scholar. It sounds, Darren, just like the folks who we have assembled here. And the Halloween story that Judge Bork loved to relate went this way. The Yale Law School has a tradition that the dean comes from the faculty, no outsiders. And so when his colleague from the faculty, Harry Wellington, was elevated to the deanship, the new dean got a great idea for his first Halloween. He had only been dean for some few weeks. And Dean Wellington was blessed with younger children. And so on this Halloween evening in New Haven, he put the kids in the car and ferried them around with a very strategic plan in mind. He targeted certain houses in New Haven. The idea was that he would deposit his appropriately costume-clad kids who were unrecognizable and place them on the sidewalk, it was dark, at the homes of certain underproductive Yale faculty members. The kids were operating under a strict discipline. They were told, go up to the door, ring the doorbell. It doesn't matter who answers the door. You do not say trick or treat. You say, let's practice, publish or perish. Well, those of us gathered here are not in danger of any such unpleasant intrusion on hallowed evening. It began over 2,000 years ago with an ancient Celtic celebration, an ancient festival. The celebration of the new year, which was deemed to begin on November 1st. And that early people believed that on the night, New Year's Eve, as it were, of October 31st, the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead became blurred. A millennium later, in the year 1000 Anno Domini, the Catholic Church took that tradition and reshaped it and established that New Year's Day for the Celts as All Saints' Day. And so the day before, including the evening, became All Hallows' Eve, which we came to know as Hallowed Eve. And so in the Christian tradition, we honor Christmas Eve. We celebrate, sometimes over much, New Year's Eve in a secular sense. Some of us are deeply thankful for the blessings of the year that has passed, and we give thanks for a hopeful year to come. And so how appropriate on this hallowed evening that we lift up the traditions of the saints, especially those who gave their lives to thoughtful reflection. In a real way, we are honoring that great Christian intellectual tradition on this hallowed evening, as well as tomorrow and the next day. The great man would have celebrated his 200th birthday. Well, that's a long time for the pilgrimage, for the journey, as Jacob of old put it. But his mighty contributions to Christian theology and philosophy and other disciplines provide this deep reservoir for study and for those of us who haven't studied Kierkegaard since undergraduate days, reminders and reflections, including by this evening's plenary speaker, Baylor's own Stephen Evans. At Baylor, we are immoderately proud of Steve, but not in a vainglorious way. Educated at Wheaton and Yale, he's taught for over 35 years, and he continues to discover and to take us co-discoverers along with him. He's published, as I hope everyone in the audience now knows, no fewer than 6 books on Kierkegaard alone. No publish or perish problems here. And his latest book, published in very recent months, is the very well received, I think it will become renowned, Natural Signs and the Knowledge of God. Isn't that an important intellectual contribution in a highly secular age? So, needless to say, nobody's going to be knocking on Steve Evans's door tonight with a Wellingtonian cry, child or otherwise. We're all the better, not just at Baylor, but literally around the world, as a result of Steve's towering scholarship. And now for his lecture this evening, Kierkegaard on Natural Theology, Why We Can Know There Is a God Without Proofs. Comfort and joy. Please join me in welcoming University Professor of Philosophy and Humanities, Dr. Stephen Evans.
Before he totally disappears for another obligation, I should thank Judge Starr for that very kind and generous and warm introduction. Thank you very much. What a night. What a great night. I'll always remember this night and this time, and I'm just thankful to be here. What a privilege. Here I am giving a talk on Kierkegaard at my own beloved university, with you as an audience. So many of you, including so many distinguished scholars, wonderful colleagues, former students, current students. It's a great privilege. I have to begin with some thanks, though, besides thanking Judge Starr. I want to thank Darren for embracing the idea of this conference when Paul and I proposed it 4 years ago. And not just embracing it, but the incredible way that Darren and his staff have carried out the plan. They've really done a great job, and I know you're all going to enjoy your time here very, very much. There are literally so many people in this audience that I should thank. I owe so much to so many of you. I've learned so much from some of you. Some of you have challenged me in helpful ways, corrected me when I needed to be corrected. And it would be impossible for me to single out, to mention everybody that I really should mention, but nevertheless, I'm going to take just a moment to mention two individuals who are very special. I owe a very special debt of gratitude to them. One of them is Merrill Westphal, sitting right here on the front, who was my teacher at Yale, the first person who really helped me understand what is going on in Kierkegaard, a person who's been a model of how Christian philosophy should be done, and he's been such a great friend and encourager to me over the years. So I want to say publicly thanks to Merrill. The second person is Robert Perkins, sitting right here on the row. I can't begin to list all the things that Robert has done, not just for me, but for the whole Kierkegaard community. Without him, we probably wouldn't have the Kierkegaard newsletter, likely we wouldn't even have a Kierkegaard Society in North America, and we certainly would not have the many splendid volumes of the International Kierkegaard Commentary. What a great work of love this was on Bob's part. Through the IKC, Bob Perkins mentored several generations of young Kierkegaard scholars, and some who are not so young anymore, like myself. And I think there are a lot of people in the room tonight who would join me in saying thank you to Robert Perkins. So. There are two handouts, so if you only have one, you're missing one. One handout is a set of quotations that I'll be referring to, and the other is an outline, so that if it doesn't seem to make sense, at least it will look like it makes sense. There is an obscure footnote in Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments in which Johannes Climacus, the pseudonymous author, describes a man who wants to prove the existence of God as a, quote, superb subject for a crazy comedy. In Kierkegaard's papers, we find a much longer version of this footnote that was deleted from the very final stage of the book. The book was already in proofs, and it was deleted. In this longer version of the note, Kierkegaard, and it's important to note that Kierkegaard originally wrote this book intending to publish it under his own name. The pseudonym is added at the same time that he deletes the long version of the footnote. So I think we can safely say that the original version of the footnote was one that Kierkegaard wrote in his own voice. In the longer version of the footnote, which is on your handout, Kierkegaard explains why this situation is comical. He imagines a man deluded into thinking that he could prove that God exists, and then has an atheist accept it by virtue of the other's proof. It's comic, he says, because both the man who produces the proof and the atheist are fantastic figures. That is, figures that cannot exist in real life. Just as no one has ever proved it, God's existence, so there has never been an atheist. Even though there certainly have been many who have been unwilling to allow what they know, that God exists, to have control or power over their minds. Did Kierkegaard really think that there has never been an atheist? Now you might think that since the long version of the footnote was deleted, perhaps Kierkegaard thought better of this outrageous claim before publishing the book. But I think a more plausible explanation of the deletion is this. After all, Kierkegaard, as I said, made this change at the last minute when he decided to attribute the book to the humorist Johannes Climacus, and he removes his own name as author. Since Climacus as a pseudonymous character doesn't claim to be a Christian, I think it's plausible to think that the footnote accurately expressed Kierkegaard's own viewpoint, but he recognized that it did not fit with the views of the more enigmatic Climacus, who does not tell us, at least in fragments, where his own religious commitments lie. I'm going to argue tonight that it is precisely the longer version of this footnote that expresses Kierkegaard's own view of what I shall call natural religious knowledge. That view can only be called a forthright version of Platonism, as a later passage in this same deleted footnote makes clear. With respect to the existence of God, immortality, etc., in short, with respect to all problems of immanence, recollection applies. It, the knowledge that can be recollected, exists altogether in every person, only they don't know it. It's a classic piece of Platonism. Of course, the idea that Kierkegaard was a kind of Christian Platonist fits very poorly with the popular conception of Kierkegaard that we have in the textbooks as the father of existentialism. That popular conception, which I think is mostly derived from the picture of Kierkegaard found in the writings of Camus and Sartre, goes something like this. Kierkegaard recognized that the traditional rational arguments for God were a failure, and thus that belief in God has no rational basis. However, because for him life without God would be meaningless and absurd, he thought that humans, through a heroic act of will, should take a leap of faith and believe in God anyway. I actually have a running shirt called I Leap for Kierkegaard on the top. I thought about wearing it tonight, but decided against it. Now, Camus, for one, thought that this idea of the leap was somewhat weak and unmanly, you might say. His heroic figure is Sisyphus, who ceaselessly pushes a rock up the mountain only to see it crash down again. Despite the pointlessness of his life, Sisyphus refuses the leap. He embraces the absurdity of existence. And I think Camus sort of projects onto Kierkegaard this idea that was a refused possibility, but obviously it had some attraction for Camus himself. Oddly, even some Christian writers have embraced Camus' view of Kierkegaard. Francis Schaeffer, for example, in his comprehensive story of the intellectual history of the West, credits Kierkegaard with the invention of what he called the two-story universe, with an upper and lower sphere separated by what Schaeffer called the line of despair. On this view, Kierkegaard saw that the universe, as understood by modern thinkers, was meaningless, and so Kierkegaard postulated an irrational upper story of religious truth to provide meaning and purpose. This popular conception of Kierkegaard as a kind of irrationalist who gave up on reason because reason offers us only a meaningless and hopeless world, I think is totally false. I'm going to try to show that Kierkegaard thinks that God's reality is or should be obvious to every person. Kierkegaard is opposed to proofs of God's existence, but one of the reasons he's so opposed is because proving God's existence makes something that should be obvious look as if it's doubtful. On his view, a person who attempts to prove God is actually working against himself. He's like a man who announces he wants to give the other people in his village a huge sum of money as a gift, but first offers them an elaborate argument that he's doing a good thing. Their natural reaction will be suspicion, both of his offer and of his arguments. Now, Kierkegaard's critique of arguments for God's existence has given him the reputation of being a critic of natural theology. Does he reject natural theology? Well, of course, as we say in philosophy, it depends on what you mean by natural theology. If one thinks that natural theology necessarily involves an attempt to offer logical arguments for God's existence, especially arguments that are made from some kind of objective, detached standpoint with premises that any rational person should be able to grasp, then Kierkegaard certainly rejects natural theology. He rejects the idea of a proof of God's existence, partly, as I just said, because it makes it appear that there might be some doubt about the matter, but also because what might be called the stance of the person who constructs such a proof, a stance that Kierkegaard sees as a stance of being objective and detached, is actually a stance that takes one's gaze away from the factors that make it possible for actual humans to know God. Suppose, however, that someone thinks that natural theology could consist, instead of logical arguments, of a narrative an account of how a natural knowledge of God is possible, a plausible story about how an awareness of God's reality could be acquired by ordinary people that is not dependent on God's special revelation in the history of Israel that culminates in the story of Jesus. If that is what natural theology is or could be, then I think Kierkegaard is not opposed to natural theology at all. It's true he doesn't focus very much on epistemological issues, and I'll say something about why later. He spends very little time giving us an account of how natural religious knowledge is possible. But I think it's clear he thinks that a person can have an awareness of God's reality without having such an account. We don't need a theory about how we can know God in order to know God. Nevertheless, I think one can see embedded in Kierkegaard's writings an account of how ordinary people do know that God is real. Kierkegaard both accepts the reality of natural religious knowledge, and I think he has a view about how such knowledge is gained. On my view, Kierkegaard thus does offer us something that could reasonably be described as natural theology. Now, before proceeding, let me first say something about my use of the word knowledge. I'm going to talk about the knowledge of God, as I've already talked. Some people may object to this term. I want to say that I speak of this natural religious knowledge as a form of knowledge because I think it satisfies all the epistemological desiderata one might want for something to count as knowledge. If God exists, then when ordinary people believe in God, they have a true belief. Furthermore, I would argue, at least if my preferred epistemological views are correct, sometimes the people who have these beliefs are justified in holding the beliefs. It's even possible for them to have a degree of confidence or certitude about those beliefs. To me, that sounds like knowledge, though it's clearly nothing like knowledge in a scientific sense of the word. But nothing important that I have to say hinges on my use of the word knowledge. And if you object to that term, you're free to substitute, whenever I say knowledge, just substitute justified belief or warranted belief or something like that. Now, it's well known that Kierkegaard's pseudonymous authorship has a novel-like quality. The pseudonymous writings are attributed to characters with outlandish names: Victor Eremita, Constantine Constantius, Hilarious Bookbinder, Johannes de Silencio, Johannes Climacus, just to mention a few. Furthermore, many other characters appear as part of the volumes, including, of course, Johannes the Seducer and some other aesthetes who make drunken speeches about women in the first part of Stages on Life's Way, the young man from Repetition, Judge William, and so on. So you have this huge cast of characters in the authorship. One remarkable fact that I think is seldom commented on is that this amazing panoply of characters doesn't include a single atheist. Somebody will probably correct me on this tonight, but I couldn't think of one. Even the seducer from Either or One speaks in a matter-of-fact way about God. He says, "After all, my God is not the God who belongs to me, but the God to whom I belong." It's true that the seducer doesn't care very much about God, and he can even take a cynical view of God, because he takes a cynical view of about everything, but he never denies the reality of God. He is, you might say, no Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins. Now, why should this be so? I suspect it's so because Kierkegaard doesn't take the figure of the vehement atheist, what we might call the evangelical atheist, very seriously. Of course, Kierkegaard knows there are people who describe themselves as atheists or free thinkers. He mentions these people from time to time. Sometimes he even says nice things about them. He compares them very favorably with people who claim to believe in God but have little concern or passion for God in their lives. Unlike conformist representatives of Christendom, the evangelical atheist at least feels some passion about the matter, and that's a good thing from Kierkegaard's point of view. However, Kierkegaard feels no need to respond to the intellectual challenge to faith posed by the evangelical atheist. The closest he comes to response is what I would call a therapeutic diagnosis, given in Sickness Unto Death, about a person who declares Christianity to be false. Such a person is described as one who is in the grip of offense, seen as one of the most intense forms of despair. From Kierkegaard's perspective, someone who claims to be an atheist then is truly a person who is, quote, unwilling to allow what he knows to have power over his mind. To take the arguments of such people too seriously is to fail to recognize that their own unbelief is in most cases a motivated unbelief. It involves what a Freudian would call repressed knowledge. Kierkegaard's pseudonym Climacus surely speaks for Kierkegaard as well when he criticizes the idea of proving God's existence. To prove the existence of one who is present is the most shameless affront, since it is an attempt to make him ridiculous. For how could it occur to anyone to prove that he exists unless one had permitted oneself to ignore him, and then makes matters worse by proving his existence right before his nose? God is, or ought to be, present to us human beings. And if a person feels the need to argue for God's existence, that is a reliable sign that the person is ignoring the ways God is in fact present to that individual. Either that, or this person has lost or never acquired the skills that allow one to recognize God. Climacus goes on to compare God to a king and says that if a person was in the majestic presence of a king, then who tried to prove the king's existence, he would be insulting the king. He would be making a fool of the king. No, he says, one indicates an awareness of the king by an appropriate expression of submission. Similarly, he says, one proves God's existence by worship. But you might ask, how is God present to human individuals? I think the answer is, God is present to us as the one with authority who demands of us that we live our lives in a certain kind of way. God is the Lord. And if he is not known as the Lord, the one who must be obeyed, he is not really known at all. Climacus makes this point by arguing that God cannot be clearly seen in world history because as it, that is, world history is seen by us humans, God does not play the role of Lord, as one does not see the ethical in it. Therefore, God is not seen either. When we look at world history, we don't clearly see the ethical, and so we don't see God. Now, I think the implication of this is when we do look at our own lives ethically, we will see God. When we see the world through ethical lenses, God can be present to us. For Kierkegaard, anyone who has a moral conscience has at least an implicit awareness of God and God's requirements. For, he says, to have a conscience simply is to have a relationship in which you as a single individual relate yourself to yourself before God. The whole idea of conscience is you feel you are responsible, accountable. Similarly, in Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard's pseudonym Anticlimacus explains that God's judgments, unlike the judgments of a human judge or authority, cannot be evaded if we humans mutiny as a group or as a crowd, because God judges humans as single individuals. Anticlimacus actually says that God's judgments in eternity will be easy. He says, quote, a child could pass judgment in eternity. Why? Because we human persons, through our conscience, make a report about ourselves every time we sin. Thus, Anticlimacus, too, identifies a God relationship with conscience. Support for this view is also found in works of love, where Kierkegaard claims that God is the true source of our ethical duties. God has a justifiable claim on us, on our obedience. He is the one who created us out of nothing. He has destined us for a life of love and happiness in relationship to himself and others. And just as human lovers acquire obligations to each other through their interaction, through their history with each other, so our history makes it true that God has a claim on us. He says that eternal love history, your history with God, has begun much earlier than any human love relationship. It began with your beginning, when you came into existence out of nothing. And just as surely as you do not become nothing, it does not end at the grave. So we have a debt to God, and we therefore must obey God. But you shall love God, he says, in unconditioned obedience, even if what he requires of you might seem to you to be to your own harm. Indeed, even harmful to his cause. For God's wisdom is beyond all comparison with yours. All you have to do is obey and love. Now, in Works of Love and many other places, Kierkegaard describes modernity, modern culture, as a kind of concerted mutiny against this divine authority. He thinks that modernity involves an attempt to depose God as our rightful moral ruler and usurp his role by thinking of ourselves as the author of the moral law. He says, this is a quote, "The modern world is a more or less open intent to depose God in order to install human beings in the rights of God." We think that morality's requirements can be determined by us, either by individual humans or perhaps by some kind of social agreement, a proposal that Kierkegaard mocks, another quotation. Or should the determination of what is the law's requirement perhaps be an agreement among, a common decision by all people to which the individual has to submit? Splendid. That is, if it is possible to find the place and fix a date for this assembling of all people, all the living, all of them, and what about the dead? And if it is possible, something that is equally impossible, for all of them to agree on one thing. The result of the mutiny is moral confusion and moral disintegration. The only solution to the problem, according to Kierkegaard, is for each one of us separately to receive our orders from God. Of course, modernity doesn't describe this mutiny as a revolt, it describes it as liberation, the achievement of full human autonomy. But Kierkegaard steadfastly rejects such a view of human freedom. An absolute freedom turns out to be a meaningless freedom. Meaningful choices require a world where there are real distinctions between good and evil and between right and wrong. Modernity has unleashed a vortex which makes meaningful choice impossible. Being accountable to God is not incompatible with genuine freedom. In fact, he says it's only when we are infinitely bound to God that we can be genuinely free. As I've argued in other places, Kierkegaard thus holds a divine command view of our moral obligations. The demands of moral duty are literally God's requirements on us. The voice of conscience is literally the voice of God. The fact that our moral duties are divine commands does not, of course, mean that Kierkegaard thinks morality is in any way arbitrary. Kierkegaard is not a radical voluntarist who thinks that God simply decides what is good and makes it good by his will. God is himself the good for Kierkegaard, and God is essentially love. So God's commands are not arbitrary. They're necessarily aimed at the good. They're necessarily aimed at fostering love in us. Nevertheless, the acts God commands acquire a new status by virtue of the fact that God commands them. When we violate his commands, our actions are not only bad, because our actions no longer aim at the good. That would be true even without God's commands. They are wrong because they constitute a failure to acknowledge the debt we owe to God. They disrupt our relation to God, who has a rightful claim on our love and obedience. All sins are therefore, for Kierkegaard, sins against God. Now, one might object to this in the following way. We might say, surely you can't be serious in claiming that the voice of conscience is the voice of God. Don't we all know that conscience is a kind of human construction? Isn't it very culturally relative, shaped by all kinds of contingent cultural factors? After all, there are some people in the world who believe that morality demands that dead human bodies should be buried. Others think that morality demands that dead human bodies should be cremated. And still others believe that morality demands that dead humans should be exposed to vultures. They can't all be right. Surely all these contradictory commands cannot be the voice of God. Are not our human consciences then obviously all too human in their origin to see them as in any way coming from God? That's a strong objection to what I've said. I think Kierkegaard would agree that human conscience is in fact shaped by highly contingent historical factors. For sure, he completely rejects the Kantian fable that human morality is something we come to know by pure a priori reason. We come to know right and wrong through history, We are taught what is right and wrong by our parents and our elders. That's true. And of course, there are large differences in the moral traditions of various cultures. Also similarities, of course. But I don't think this fact disturbs Kierkegaard for two reasons. One is he makes a distinction between the form and content of our moral lives. The most important fact about our moral lives is that we recognize that we have duties. We are morally accountable beings. If we have mistaken views about the content of some of our moral duties, we still rightly recognize that we are morally accountable beings. The second factor is a conviction he has that even with all what we might call the cultural chatter, some genuine information about what God requires can still get through, and usually does get through. There is a quality in us humans that Kierkegaard values highly. He calls it, it's not a very good translation, the English term is usually translated as primitiveness or primitivity. Danish is primitivitet, so it's a cognate. But what is primitiveness or primitivity? It has nothing to do with going out in the woods and, rolling around with the leaves or anything like that. Primitivity, I think the term could be translated as sort of authenticity or something like that. It refers, I think, to an authentic awareness of God's requirements. When you as an individual are willing to stand up and cut away some of the cultural chatter and still hear what God is saying to you, that's what Kierkegaard calls primitiveness or primitivity. We can now understand why Kierkegaard is not enthusiastic about a certain kind of apologetics. Many apologists implicitly accept what I would call the standard narrative about why religious faith has declined among intellectuals in Europe and North America in the last couple of hundred years. The narrative, this is very simple, memorably expressed in Bertrand Russell's famous quip about what would you say to God, Russell, if after death you find you were wrong and you find yourself in the presence of God. And Russell says, I would just tell God, not enough evidence. You didn't give us enough evidence. So on this account, religious belief has declined because we don't have enough evidence, primarily for intellectual reasons. Hume and Kant undermined the rational case for God by showing the proofs don't work. Modern science has shown the natural world can be explained without theology. Historical biblical criticism has undermined belief that the Bible is an inspired revelation from God, so the arguments go. All such accounts presume that modern intellectuals have rejected belief in God because of their intelligence and intellectual honesty. Belief has declined because we've just become so smart, so much more intelligent, so less credulous. Kierkegaard doesn't buy this narrative. It gives an overly flattering view of modern intellectuals. It presumes they're all willing to believe if only their intellectual problems could be solved. But on Kierkegaard's view, religious faith has declined among intellectuals not because they're so smart, but because their imaginations are so weak and their emotional lives are so impoverished. If it's true that many intellectuals don't believe in God, it's either because they don't want to believe, or else it is because the natural human capacities that ought to allow them to recognize God at work in their lives have atrophied. They're no longer working properly. I think it is because Kierkegaard does not accept the standard narrative as to why religious faith has declined that he does not ascribe to epistemology the importance it has had for many modern Western philosophers. Modern Western philosophy, of course, began with Locke and Descartes, and it was inspired from the beginning by anxieties fueled by religious disagreements and the scientific revolution. Many modern philosophers have, as John Dewey thought, been engaged in a quest for certainty, a quest for an objective certainty. They have sought for a method that will vanish doubt once and for all, give us truth that is final and sure. For this reason, modern philosophy is dominated by epistemological concerns. Kierkegaard notably doesn't share this obsession with epistemology. To be sure, he has epistemological views. Marilyn Piety in our audience has published a very fine book on Kierkegaard's understanding of knowledge. However, Kierkegaard does not think that knowledge depends on epistemology. He rejects the idea that until we have the right theory of knowledge, we can't know anything. Philosophy of knowledge is like philosophy of art. We couldn't begin to theorize about art if we didn't already recognize art. Similarly, we could make no progress in giving an account of knowledge if we didn't already know some things prior to philosophizing about knowledge. So knowledge does not have to wait for epistemology, and religious knowledge doesn't have to wait for epistemology either. Kierkegaard does not embark on a quest for a method that will give us humans objective certainty about the questions that concern us the most. Such a method would be, this was the ideal, would be a method that would give all normal humans, regardless of their abilities and concerns, some sort of guaranteed access to the truth. Instead, Kierkegaard thinks we must accept and embrace our finitude. We are profoundly historical creatures, situated. The path to truth for us is not one that leads us to what has been called the view from nowhere. The perspective Spinoza put forward is the human ideal, in which we try to see the world as God sees it, under the aspect of eternity. Rather, we must see the world as God has created us to see it, as the finite, fallible, and even sinful creatures we are. We can achieve the truth we need to know by becoming the creatures we were created to be. If we fail to grasp truths we ought to know, we must not assume the problem lies in the evidence. The problem may lie in us. What does this mean? Partly it means recognizing we are not purely thinking things. We are embodied persons whose lives, including our intellectual lives, are deeply shaped by our hearts. That is, what a person knows and believes is intimately connected to what a person desires and fears and hopes and loves. Our emotions and passions are not just distorting filters that must be peeled away if we are to see reality rightly. Sometimes they are factors, skills, capacities that allow us to connect with the world in the right way. Once we understand that our natural religious knowledge comes to us through conscience and our knowledge of the ethical, we can understand why Kierkegaard is the great philosopher of subjectivity. For the emotions and passions play a key role in becoming aware of what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. We cannot see the need to help another person if we cannot feel compassion for the suffering of the other person. We cannot aspire to live courageously if we are not inspired by courageous actions. We cannot value honesty if we cannot feel the shamefulness of a shabby lie told to save a few bucks. It is in and through the passions and emotions, then, that we become aware of God's claim on our lives. The person who lacks this sense of the ethical is the person who lacks primitiveness. People who lack this quality will not be helped simply by getting an education, acquiring more information, or becoming scientifically illiterate. In fact, those remedies might make the problem worse. It may just strengthen this person's objective, detached attitude towards human life. What such a person needs, then, is not primarily apologetical arguments. Rather, the person needs to care more deeply about the point of living a human life, a caring that will lead to that kind of deep thinking that Kierkegaard calls subjective thinking. The concept of subjective thinking, then, has nothing to do with being arbitrary. It is not tied to wish fulfillment, and it's fully compatible with a searing honesty, concern, and love for truth. Subjective thinking centers on the passionate kind of thinking that grips a person when a person thinks thoughts such as this: I have but one life to live. That life is finite. Death looms ahead for me. What should I do with my life? What is its purpose? What is its meaning? Such a person, I think, will be open to hearing the voice of conscience, and conscience will have for that person the kind of authority that testifies to its divine origin. So far from denying that humans have a natural knowledge of God, I think it would be closer to the truth to say Kierkegaard takes it for granted that humans can know that God exists through their awareness of God's claim on their lives. He takes this for granted, but it never becomes a major or central theme in his authorship. The reason this is so, I think, is that in comparison with the knowledge of God made possible by the Christian revelation, this natural knowledge of God is a poor thing. In conclusion, I want to say something about the limits of our natural religious knowledge and how this kind of knowledge relates to the kind of knowledge of God that is made possible through the Christian revelation. The first point to be made, of course, is that for Kierkegaard, mere propositional knowledge that there is a God has little value. It does a person little good to know that the proposition God exists is true, or to even have true knowledge of God's attributes, unless the person in some way cares about God. Of course, people ought to care. Perhaps they will do so if God is rightly understood. But it's a striking fact that although around 90% of Americans say they believe there is a God, many of those same people will admit that religious faith has very little importance in their lives. So what is important is not knowing the right propositions about God, it's knowing God, recognizing God's reality, taking seriously God's claims on our life. Of course, a person who knows God in this richer sense will also know that God exists, but there are many who have a knowledge of God's existence without really knowing God. A second major limitation with our natural religious knowledge of God is that this knowledge is highly unreliable. It's shot through with mistakes. In the very footnote with which I began this talk, Kierkegaard makes this point. In claiming there's never been a true atheist and that all humans know about God and immortality, he says that all this knowledge is obtained by recollection, clearly signifying that it is gained through natural human capacities and not through a supernatural revelation. But though everyone has this knowledge, at least implicitly, Kierkegaard adds that the conceptions of God and immortality people have, quote, may be very inadequate. In other words, people may rightly know that there is a God, but have very mistaken ideas about what God is like. He's clearly right about that. Religious belief may indeed be something we human beings are hardwired to have. Evolutionary psychologists are increasingly today drawn to the idea that we humans do have an innate tendency to form a belief in God or gods. One psychologist says that children are promiscuous theists. They promiscuously form belief in gods. They just naturally do that. However, you can see that there's something to this sort of theory by looking at the ubiquity of religious belief in every tribal culture in the world. However, the wild diversity of the beliefs this natural disposition produces shows that it cannot be very reliable in its content. Kierkegaard himself is very much aware then of what we might call the Feuerbachian point, that although we humans may believe in God, we have a strong tendency to create a God in our own image. Our natural knowledge of God is thus riddled with error, distorted by wish fulfillment and self-deception. We have an inveterate tendency to soften God's requirements, to create for ourselves a God who will baptize and sanctify what we want to do instead of holding us accountable to His laws. The fact that our natural religious knowledge is unreliable, however, does not mean that it has no value at all. C.S. Lewis says somewhere, and I can't remember where I read this, that he was asked sometimes if he doesn't worry that England is becoming a pagan country. And Lewis says his answer was, I wish it were true. The reason is not hard to discern. Missionaries have always found cultures that adhere to pagan or tribal religions to be fertile grounds for converts. Such people already know that there is a God or gods. They often even know that there is a supreme or high God. They know the importance of the spiritual realm. They want to know the gods and have a right relation to the gods. The missionary's task then is just to help these people come to understand God's true nature and how we are to know Him and respond to Him. Natural religious knowledge, when it is motivated by a passionate desire to know and please God, then can have genuine value as preparation for the gospel. I think this is clearly what Kierkegaard has in mind, including unscientific postscript, when he has Climacus describe religiousness A, a kind of natural religiousness, he says, that is possible outside of Christianity. Religiousness A has as its essential expression suffering, and its decisive expression the discovery of guilt. For Kierkegaard, human religions, then, are basically attempts to understand the meaning of suffering and to deal with the problem of guilt. Now, religiousness A is not Christianity. Christianity does not start from eminence or recollection. It starts with the transcendent revelation from God. Christianity teaches us that guilt is sin. The major difference is that guilt is a problem we think we can solve, but when we begin to understand guilt as sin, we understand it's a problem that exceeds our capacity to solve. We must rely on God's grace given through Christ if we are to be forgiven and made whole. However, although Christianity is not religiousness A, there is a sense in which Christianity only makes sense to people who are struggling with the problems of guilt and suffering religiousness A is trying to solve. Christianity does involve content, what he calls the dialectical, a new way of thinking about oneself and God. But he says religiousness A must first be present in the individual before there can be any consideration of becoming aware of the dialectical. Before you can even understand Christianity, you have to have those concerns that are shaped by religiousness A. So our natural religious life then has genuine value. It provides, you might say, the precondition for understanding the Christian gospel and taking it seriously. So this natural religious knowledge, while not without value, it's inadequate for Kierkegaard in a twofold manner. First, the conception of God it offers is usually inadequate and unreliable. But even when it is at its best, it produces an awareness of God which enables us to understand ourselves as guilty, but it has no real solution to the problem of guilt. At best, then, it helps us to understand the problem more deeply and thus see the point of God's answer to the problem of guilt in Christ. Kierkegaard thinks we therefore need a God who speaks to us from outside of conscience, a God who speaks to us through history. That's Christianity, and it's what Kierkegaard means when he says Christianity is a religion of transcendence and not eminence. When we encounter Jesus, we discover what God truly requires of us in a deeper and more accurate way. We discover God's ideal for us, and we therefore realize how deeply flawed we are, how far away from that ideal we are. And in addition to discovering how far we are from satisfying the requirement, we also discover God's marvelous provision, the atonement. In his late writings, Kierkegaard often describes Christ as both the pattern and the Redeemer. Because he is the pattern, the model, the ideal, we discover our need for redemption. Because we are redeemed, we find the strength we need to follow the pattern, the ideal. This knowledge of God that's made possible by the Christian revelation is so stunning in comparison to the natural knowledge of God. It's once one has the Christian knowledge, it's as if you didn't know God at all until you discovered him in Jesus. Of course, as fallen humans, we're capable of distorting God's special revelation as well, and Kierkegaard offers Christendom as his evidence for this. However, the power of the gospel remains. The Spirit of God can still speak to us through God's revelation in Christ. So Kierkegaard never confused his Christian faith with natural religious knowledge. No one has a deeper appreciation for the necessity for God to reveal himself to us if we are to know God truly and to relate to him as we ought. However, to say that the true knowledge of God requires us to hear and respond to God's word addressed to us does not mean that, apart from Christian faith, atheism would be the most rational view of the universe. The natural knowledge of God made possible through subjectivity still retains worth and value. Even those who have not come to know God in Jesus, then, can still recognize that there is a transcendent reality and that they are accountable to that reality. Without our natural religious knowledge, we would not even be able to understand the gospel. The gospel is the answer for the human condition and its central problem. But if we do not understand the problem, we cannot understand how the solution can be the solution. Thank you. So looks like we have some time for questions and discussion, and I see some microphones here. So if you have a question, my understanding of our protocol is that you're asked if you'll come forward and speak with the microphone so everyone can hear your question. So yes, you want to come?
Is this working? You can hear me? Good. Thank you for such a wonderful, vibrant introduction to our thoughts this weekend. When I listened to you describe your understanding of our natural knowledge of God, a knowledge that we do not require to give any proof of through argument, that we can see within ourselves if we only attend to it and listen to it speaking to us, I leaned over to my husband and I said, that sounds just exactly like Immanuel Kant's fact of reason. I said, that's exactly what Kant says about the fact of reason, that it cannot be deduced, that it is something that we find within us and that is obvious to one who only attends to it. We find the moral demands that are impressed upon us. And so imagine my horror when you went on later in your talk to distinguish your position so clearly from both autonomy, the Kantian notion of autonomy, and Kant's notion of a priori morality. My suspicion is that your worry is that Kant would not be keen on a divine command theory of morality, which you did present, that this command that we recognize in ourselves really is from God and most decidedly not from us. My question for you is whether this could be a both and instead of an either or proposition. That if we recognize this command of morality and if we are also truly made in God's image, that there is some part of us that is truly the best part of us, commands of us just exactly what God commands of us. And if that could be true, do we need to choose between a divine command theory and a theory of autonomy?
Thanks. That's a great question. Maybe more than one question bound up there. Let me say a couple of things about my view of Kant and how I think Kant relates to Kierkegaard. First of all, and this will probably be more shocking than anything else I've said tonight, in my book, I won't fault our president because he wasn't aware of my latest book. My latest book is actually not natural knowledge, and I can't quote my own title now, but it wasn't the book he mentioned. My latest book is a book on God and moral obligation. And in that book, I defend a divine command theory of moral obligation, and I furthermore claim that Kant is a divine command theorist.
Good. I actually agree with that. And so
because Kant, I say, takes very seriously the idea that I as a moral being should think of all my moral obligations as divine commands. Now, Kant holds what I would call a minimal divine command theory, in that he doesn't think God has any discretion or choice about it, but that's okay. I think there are other divine command theorists who have that view too. And it's also, I think, very important in Kant that God is the head of the kingdom of ends. The kingdom of ends has a head, and that's God. It's not me. It's not you. And I think myself that my target here is not so much the historical Kant as it is contemporary sort of neo-Kantian or contemporary Kantian moralists.
we might have a common enemy there.
Yeah. Because I'm very sympathetic to the claim that Kant can be read in ways that you're suggesting. So I'm happy to enlist Kant partly on my side. The one point of, I think, real disagreement between Kant and Kierkegaard is over the question of whether moral knowledge is a priori. That Kierkegaard will not accept.
Although with the fact of reason as an interesting fact given to us, the whole nature of what the a priori would be has its complexities that maybe could allow them to at least be at the same dinner party together.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. I was interested in your term that you were using of primitiveness or primitivity, and another word came to my mind in terms of making a primitive decision or making an authentic decision. And I just had some echoes maybe from existentialism there about being an authentic human being, making authentic decisions. And I've heard my students say that also. They'd like to make authentic decisions, live authentically. I just wondered if you could comment about that. Is there a connection between existentialism and this primitivity and so forth?
Sure, of course there is. And of course, the textbooks who say Kierkegaard is the father of existentialism are not completely wrong. There's just something one-sided and misleading. If that's all you know about Kierkegaard, you aren't going to have the right picture. But here's the similarity. Almost all the existentialists have this concern that to be an authentic, real human being, I must be myself, not be like the crowd, the masses, not just being like everybody else. The question is, how do we do that? Kierkegaard thinks the way we can do that is not by inventing the self ourselves out of whole cloth, as perhaps might be the case for a Sartrean. He thinks rather that each one of us has what we might call an individual essence. You know, in medieval times, Duns Scotus, the great medieval philosopher, thought that in addition to creating a common human nature, that when God created us human individuals, there's an individual nature essence for each one of us, a hexaity, a thisness. And I think something like that view is present in Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard thinks when you were born, God has a sort of idea of what you should be like. And so when you become yourself by becoming the self God created you to be, and that may require you to stand up against the crowd, to be different from anybody else, not to conform. So all those existentialist themes are there, only for Kierkegaard, those themes do not require, you might say, self-invention, because this unique self is a gift which has been offered me.
Thanks for plugging my book. I have a question. I mean, I like very much your point about falling away from God or contemporary atheism not being a result of an absence of evidence for God's existence. It's not fundamentally an intellectual problem. It's a result of a sort of atrophy of feeling and imagination. What's behind that, though? That's what I am curious about, and I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I think I think there's two things to say. One thing is to say there's this motivated, willful repression. But the other thing to say is there might be what we might call atrophying, decay of capacities, which might not be culpable from the point of view of the individual, because it might be due to widespread cultural, social, historical forces. And I'm myself inclined to be maybe a bit more charitable than Kierkegaard is himself, and to say that surely a lot of the evangelical atheists are pretty doggone motivated, but there may be lots of people out there who are atheists who are somewhat innocent and not culpable. Now, not everybody's going to like that idea, but I think it may be true. They've just been taught the wrong things. They haven't been taught to use their imaginations. They haven't been taught to trust their emotions. And so they don't realize that they can do that. So, and it may not be their fault. So I think Kierkegaard may be going a little bit too strong when he hits the motivated, willful repression theme.
But what I'm curious about is why we're not taught those things. And you know, this occurred to me because I used to teach a course called Ethical Issues in Criminal Justice, and we would read a book by James Gilligan, who's a forensic psychiatrist, and he works a lot with serial killers. And there's a problem apparently among people in prison of self-mutilation. And I couldn't even read all of that section. It was really disturbing. But Gilligan's theory is that they do this because they're so deadened by the prison system that it's a way they have of confirming to themselves that they still have feeling. And I remember when I read that, I thought, I think that's why we have the kind of film that we have in the US, where we have these really horrible, violent, gory films and games, you know, computer games. It's because we're deadened as a culture, that it's a way of sort of, you know, reaffirming to ourselves that we can feel anything. But
Yeah.
what's behind that atrophy of feeling and imagination? It's so puzzling.
Yeah, Kierkegaard thinks that part of it is, of course, the overvaluing of what we might call objectivity and detachment and the scientific kind of perspective on the world. And this even creeps into theology. We no longer think of theology as a kind of practical knowledge of God, but it's like everything else. It's a science, it's part of the university curriculum, and we find people, in a sense, doing theology who could care less about God, or, you know, sadly, or philosophers too, doing philosophy of religion who really could care less about religion, you know, just an interesting intellectual. So, but why we do, you know, I guess that's a question for the historians and maybe the psychologists and people wiser than me to answer. I don't think I have much intelligent to say. Yes.
Thank you, by the way, for a fine speech. Just one little thing where you talked about, to get to religion B, Christianity, you had to be straight on some things in religion A. It struck me that that might be a little bit like, before you can know something, you have to be straight on the theory of knowledge. Or perhaps closer to that, before you can read the scripture and hear the word of God, you have to get straight on an epistemology of how the scripture exactly is the word of God. I guess I don't think you really have to go through religion A to get to religion B, because when God comes and reveals himself to somebody, he can get anybody.
Well, sure, God's capable of acting in all kinds of direct and miraculous and marvelous ways. But when I said religiousness A is the precondition for Christianity, I don't mean to say one must think of religiousness A or have that sort of theory in your mind or conceptualize religion in that way at all. What I mean is that the things religiousness A, in a sense, points to have to be things that are present in your life. But who doesn't suffer? Human life includes suffering. And one of the things as human beings we want to know is, does suffering mean anything? Is there a meaning in suffering? Is it just pointless? Is it just something we try to avoid as much as possible? Or does it mean something? And the second thing I think honest people face is guilt. So what I mean when I say religion is just that people have an awareness of suffering and its importance and guilt. And I think ordinary people without any theoretical abilities can certainly have that kind of awareness.
That's true, and it can be used. I think when I listen to some of the testimonies of people, even like people like Nicky Cruz, that God nails them when they don't have any of that stuff in them.
Yeah, well, sometimes there are remarkable stories, and people have all kinds of stories. But I do think in most cases, when people turn to God, they must have some sense of their need for God. And so there must be some kind of problem, some kind of lack, some kind of inadequacy. Maybe they weren't even aware of that lack or inadequacy. Maybe God had to give them that awareness first. But that can be grace as well. I think, isn't that what the hymn says? 'Twas grace that taught me. How's it go? Grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. Yes.
Hi. So my question has to do with the follow-up question from earlier with respect to the willful desire. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
No, I can. Speak loudly. Yeah.
With respect to the willful desire to suppress the knowledge of God. So I guess just a follow-up question on that. So if someone is, as you said, willing, right? So you sort of somewhat reject Kierkegaard's strong belief that we all willfully suppress God. But what about that person that, in a sense, genuinely wants to believe but can't for some other reason, right? So they're deficient in some way. So would you say that in that situation, then objective proofs of God would serve a role to help them, perhaps, with that condition? if they actually are willful, right? So would that be a possible role for the objective approach?
Well, it depends on what you mean by objective. I mean, here, in my book, Natural Knowledge and Signs of God, I think I got the title right that time. Natural Signs and Knowledge of God. The thesis of the book is that the classical arguments for God's existence all embody a kind of awareness of something in nature or in our experience that God has put there which points to God. It's a natural sign. And the persuasiveness, the power of the proof, comes from that sign that's embedded in the proof. And I don't say that the proofs have no persuasiveness or power. So what I would say in this case, if someone sees the sign and they're looking for God, they're open for God, they're willing to look, then that argument, insofar as it embodies, may have value for that person. But now notice that what's going on, we don't have pure objectivity. We now have someone who is thinking hard, and in a sense, we have subjective thinking in Kierkegaard's sense. So I don't actually think myself that Kierkegaard's views are compatible. I don't think they rule out all apologetic arguments. Just apologetic arguments that are in some way supposed to supplant or replace subjectivity.
Right, remove the element of subjectivity. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I was wondering, I understand your argument about, or Kierkegaard's argument, I suppose, about the lack of atheists as a ideology. I was wondering, though, how you would explain, perhaps to a self-proclaimed atheist, the idea that there is no such thing as an atheist.
It's a tough sell. Actually, I remember having a conversation. I was speaking a few years ago at the University of Colorado, and Michael Tooley was in my audience. Some of you who are philosophers will know Michael Tooley. He's a rather aggressive atheist, infamous for having written a paper defending infanticide, among other things. But anyway, so Tooley took great personal umbrage. I made some remarks along these lines. And he basically said, "You've insulted me. You're claiming that I know God, but I'm not willing to, that I'm repressing this, that I'm not being intellectually honest." And so here's what I told him. I said, maybe you're thinking about this in the wrong way, Michael. Maybe you should think that I'm complimenting you. What I'm saying is, you think you're an atheist, but actually you have a kind of de re awareness of God's reality. You really do know there's a God. You just don't know you do. So I'm actually complimenting you here, insofar as you. Let me just say on the question of motivation. I've been teaching philosophy a long time, as Judge Starr mentioned, and I've seen some cases of motivated atheism, even among philosophers who claim to be neutral and disinterested. I can remember a really interesting event when I was still teaching at St. Olaf. We had, I won't mention the name of the philosopher, but we had a very famous philosopher come in, and he was talking about something totally remote from, well, not directly connected to philosophy of religion or theology. We were talking about philosophy of mind. And one of my colleagues, who's still at St. Olaf, Charles Tollifer, who has sometimes a twinkle in his eye when he asks such questions, the philosopher was defending a materialistic view of mind, saying minds are basically just brains, made. And Tollifer raised his hand and said, "But Professor so-and-so, I don't see how your view accounts for angels. They have minds." And for God, and what about God? He asked very innocently. The philosopher in question got visibly angry. He started twitching, and he literally said, "When people start talking about God, I want to go for my gun." So there's a case where somebody hit a nerve, and it didn't take much. Even a joke would set this guy off. So there are people like that out there. Maybe those of us who've had the pleasure of living in the Bible Belt haven't met as many of them as some of the rest of us have. Yeah.
Thank you.
Early on in your discussion of the natural knowledge of God, you acknowledged that there might be various ways of construing the term knowledge. My concern is with the other term, natural. It seems that in your presentation, you define the natural knowledge of God as what would be natural as something like universal subjectivity, subjectivity that was kind of uniform and universal among all human beings. Is that what natural means? Is that what Kierkegaard would mean by the natural? Does he discuss the natural in his writings?
Well, the term natural, I just want to, first, here's how I would start by defining what is a special revelation from God. A special revelation from God would be a revelation that occurs at a particular point of time in history given to particular people. So there's particularity about it. And then if there's natural knowledge, it's just all the rest. All the knowledge we have about God that doesn't come through these special particular revelations that come to particular people at particular moments in time. And I think Kierkegaard's view is that the means whereby we acquire this natural knowledge is subjectivity. That's the account, that's the narrative, the story he wants to tell. There might be other stories one could tell.
So the natural is simply non-revelatory.
Not special revelation, yeah, part of general revelation. That's all I mean by it. Yeah, thanks for that clarification question. That's helpful.